When I was in the third grade of elementary school, my great-grandfather passed away. His house was the main family home of a fairly large and old family, and at his funeral, relatives and acquaintances gathered from all over Japan. Naturally, me and my family were there as well, and I remember being surprised at how many relatives there were. So many people were coming in one after another. As a kid, I didn't have anything in particular to do, so I played and hung out in the garden with my relatives' children. The family home's garden was large, with several cherry trees, a waterfall, a pond, and even a large bridge over it. There were colorful kois in the pond, and a net had been strung up near the surface of it to keep the birds away. The youngest of the children, there was a girl named Kana. Kana, who was in her third year of kindergarten, was very energetic, and even I, an elementary school boy, couldn't keep up with her stamina as she ran around and climbed trees. "Hey Kana, it's dangerous, so stop climbing trees!" My cousin Kotaro, who is the same age as me, shouted while exhausted, but Kana just giggled and didn't listen to him at all. Soon the wake began, and the children were gathered inside the house, where they each lit incense and put their hands together in prayer. I didn't have many memories of my great-grandfather, but I remember bits and pieces of him, reading me old books about airplanes while I sat on his lap, and how he taught me how to play games like juggling and flying kites. Realizing I did remember his kindness, I began to sob. Still, in my childish mind, I thought it was a blessing that he had passed away peacefully, with so many family members by his side. As the adults began to prepare the meal, I noticed something. Kana was gone. I asked Kotaro that sat next to me, where did Kana go? But he said he hadn't seen her either. Which family did Kana come from anyway? Who were her parents? I went to ask an adult nearby, but everyone said in unison, "There's no one named Kana here." Kotaro and I looked at each other, confused. After we all finished eating, the people staying at the hotel started leaving the compound. The people staying at the main house, like me and Kotaro, started to get ready to go to bed, changing into our pajamas and brushing our teeth. The adults took turns watching over the incense, so they gathered in my great-grandfather's room, sleeping together and drinking beer. My mother and the female relatives seemed busy cleaning up. Before slipping into our futons, I went out to the garden with Kotaro. I was somehow worried about Kana. How is it possible that no one knew her? Maybe a girl from the neighborhood snuck in? But she was wearing a black dress, right? That's mourning clothing. I guess that's true. If there were young children among the relatives, we should know about them. But both of us had no idea. And since the adults said they didn't know about her either, it must not have been family. A ghost, maybe? Kotaro muttered. I also thought of that possibility and became scared, so I went quiet. At that moment, "Hey!" I heard Kana's voice from the pond in the garden. I looked and saw her on the bridge. "Oh, there she is! Why are you there?" As Kotaro and I ran towards her, Kana said with a smile, "I want to play some more, but I have to go home now." "Going home where? Where are your parents?" "They're not here yet." "Not yet?" I was confused by her strange remark, and Kana's body gradually became transparent from her feet down. "Kana!" Kotaro called out. "It's okay. We'll definitely meet again." And with that, she disappeared. I don't remember exactly what words I exchanged with Kotaro after that. I just remember that my parents scolded me severely for being out in the garden that night. For a while, I remembered Kana-chan clearly, but as time passed, I gradually lost the ability to remember her voice or face, and eventually I even forgot this ever happened. But recently, I suddenly remembered Kana-chan. Years passed, and both Kotaro and I grew up. Kotaro got married and had a daughter. I met him for the first time in years at a family funeral the other day, and it was the first time I saw his daughter. When my eyes saw her, I was frozen in place. She had the spitting image of Kana-chan, whom I met at my great-grandfather's funeral that day. Her name is Kana. She's cute, isn't she? Kotaro didn't seem to remember Kana-chan at all. However, Kana-chan seemed to remember me, and she smiled and said, "See? We meet again, right?" This may not be a scary story, but it's the only strange experience I've ever had. This is a story about when I went to Scotland with my friend Satoshi, who likes whiskey, when I was still a student. One day, while drinking with Satoshi, he suddenly said to me, "Hey, let's go to Scotland. Let's drink some real scotch." This wasn't the first time Satoshi says things out of the blue, so I'm used to it, thinking, here we go again. When I save up some money, I replied in a tone of voice that sounded a little annoyed. Then Satoshi said, "Let's get a part-time job starting today and go next year." So we both skipped school and worked part-time jobs, and a year later we were finally able to go. I've always liked going overseas, but Scotland was the farthest I've ever been from Japan. It was a little luxurious, a 4-day, 3-night trip. While on the plane, Satoshi was looking really happy as he spread out travel magazines. I didn't show it, but I was as excited as he was. When we arrived in Scotland, we went straight to the hotel so we won't be bothered with our luggage. The hotel was a cottage-like place, and I was assigned to cottage number 11 and Satoshi to cottage number 13. We still had about 4 hours until dinner, so we decided to go on a walk and check what's nearby. As we were walking along the river, we saw a pub sign on an old house, so we decided to have a drink there before going back. The place had a nice atmosphere, and when we went inside, about 5 elderly people were drinking. We sat down, put some smoked meat in our mouths, and washed it down with whiskey. Time passed by. We went back to the hotel and had dinner. We had Scotch broth for dinner. After eating the meal and drinking plenty of booze, Satoshi and I went back to our cottages. Satoshi was an incredibly good sleeper and would eat a lot, drink a lot, and then go to sleep quickly, losing consciousness within 3 seconds. I always feared if that's technically called passing out. I struggled with insomnia at that time, so I was kind of jealous of him. However, when I saw him in the dining room the next morning, he had big bags under his eyes and was clearly sleep deprived. What's more, even though he usually eats a lot, he didn't eat anything at all. Thinking that something was strange, I asked Satoshi, "Hey, are you alright, man? Having jet lag or something?" "Well, actually, something strange happened last night." Satoshi began to speak with a quiet tone lacking energy. "Something strange?" "Yeah. Last night I crawled into bed like usual and fell asleep easily. But in the middle of the night, I woke up because I felt my chest area squeeze up. To the point where it woke you? We've been friends for a long time, but this was the first time I'd heard such a story from him. Normally, he won't joke about stuff like this. For the past 10 years or so, I've hardly ever woken up in the middle of the night, said Satoshi. Well, yeah, I know it's impossible for you to do something like that. I nodded vigorously, teasing him a little. The light was still on at the entrance to the room, so I knew it was still the middle of the night. I suddenly woke up, which was unusual, so I thought I'd go get some water. But when I tried to stand up, I just couldn't. What do you mean? Wouldn't I like to know? I thought maybe it was something called sleep paralysis. Then the mattress of the bed next to me, which didn't have a comforter, started to sink in. Sink in? What is that? Exactly my point. The sinking hole got bigger and bigger, and then it started to morph into something human-like, like a figure of a man. I was listening to his story. He continued. The figure came closer to me. Then, as it got to the edge of my bed, it looked like it was watching me. Then it suddenly disappeared. The moment it was gone, the upper part of my chest suddenly felt heavy, felt really suffocated. Then an invisible man climbed on top of you? That's what it was. I don't really know either. I thought it was a scary story, but I thought it was probably due to fatigue and drinking too much alcohol the night before. So I finished listening to Satoshi's story and ended it. After breakfast, I thought about going out somewhere, but Satoshi seemed sleepy, so I decided to sleep all day and prepare for the next day. By dinner time, my friend had completely regained his energy, and I was relieved to see him in good health. The next morning, the doorbell to my cottage rang, and I found Satoshi excited. Wondering what was going on, he said, "There's a mushroom crop growing under the window." I was still half asleep, but Satoshi led me to his cottage number 13 and showed me the crop circle. There were mushrooms with caps about 2 inches, forming a circle about 3 feet in full. I told Satoshi that it was probably a coincidence, but looking at Satoshi and his joyous face, I kept that thought to myself. Mushrooms. Oh geez. We drank scotch all day again, and it was time for the next day. There was still a lot of time before the flight back, so Satoshi suggested going for a walk again. This time, we decided to go to the forest. Even though it was our first time in the place, Satoshi walked through the forest as if drawn by something. I wanted to tell him to turn back, but there was something strange about his enthusiasm, so I couldn't talk to him. I continued walking through the forest in silence, and Satoshi stopped me when he came across what looked like the remains of an old castle. Although it was old enough to call it ruins, the 4-story castle building itself was still intact, and the windows and entrance doors were gaping and hollow like a skull, with its eyes and mouth open. I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine. The whole appearance and its ambience told me in an intuitive way that something was wrong. I told Satoshi that we should turn back, but he went inside without saying anything. I thought about leaving him there, but I was worried about him, so I decided to wait outside instead of going inside. While I was waiting, I took my digital camera to take a picture of the castle. It was still a cool sight to see, and we don't have anything like this in Japan. But for some reason, I couldn't press the camera's button. I gave up after trying dozens, thinking that maybe it was broken even though I had only just bought it. About an hour passed, but there was no sign of Satoshi coming back. It was almost time for a flight, so I decided to go inside to look for him. It felt a little chilly, like being inside a cave. After walking a little further, I heard laughter, and thinking it was probably Satoshi's voice, I went towards it. When I went further in, I saw Satoshi laughing alone in front of an old mirror. This was way too creepy, I thought. But I reckoned he was trying to scare me, so I told him it was time to leave. Then suddenly he stopped laughing, called my name, and said he'd be right out. Well, that was strange. To be specific, it was that although he looked and sounded exactly like Satoshi, he felt like a different person. And I came to know this to be true when we were on our flight back home. When I told him stories about my travels, he would nod along, but he would never talk about them himself. When I asked him more questions, he clearly got angry, glared at me, and went to sleep. It wasn't the joyous and talkative friend I knew at all. I was convinced that Satoshi had become a different person. After returning to Japan, we continued to live life as before. Satoshi's parents and friends didn't seem to notice anything strange about him. But I was definitely aware that I had lost my good friend. Since then, we seemed like we had parted ways. Time went by, and after I had already started working full-time, I told this story to a colleague who likes the occult and horror, and he got very interested and went to the very same hotel's cottage number 13 shortly after. When he got back to Japan, he asked me, "There was no cottage number 13. I might have heard it had been demolished, so I asked the hotel staff, but they said it never even existed in the first place. Were you guys staying at a different hotel?" I thought that was strange. One photo that Satoshi and I had taken clearly showed the cottage number, 13, on it. This is a story from when I was in the first year of junior high school. At my school, the school festival is going to be held soon. Us first graders were in charge of the flea market. The second grade was in charge of food and beverages, and desserts and candy was for the third. We would go around to households in the city to collect items for the flea market, and each household would donate a year's worth of unwanted items, just as if they were taking out oversized trash. In a few days, so many items were collected and sorted into sellable and junk items, and prices were set for each piece and pop-ups were made. One day, when all the students were preparing, one of my classmates shrieked in such a loud voice that made everyone startle. The classroom was abuzz, and the screaming classmate had a seizure and was immediately rushed to the emergency room. The homeroom teacher said that the convulsions were caused by heat stroke. But then, why did she have to scream? We were almost done pricing everything, and the classroom was buzzing again. At the center of the collected items was a Japanese doll in a glass case. The doll had a shiny skin texture and eyes that looked as if it were alive, almost human. The whole class said it was creepy and weird, but we eventually decided to sell it as a product. On the day of the school festival, there was a lot of junk that still needed to go, including the Japanese doll. We decided to sell them all together for 1,000 yen when the event was almost over. However, when we were still having trouble selling all of them, our coach came to see what we had for sale. We thought it was our chance and asked them to buy them. After the festival, we immediately went on to summer vacation. Club activities were held almost each day, but within a week, the coach that bought the junk bundle fell ill and did not come back to club activities. Several members of the club, including myself, became worried and went to visit him at his house. We were shown into the coach's room by his wife. There, we found the coach talking to the Japanese doll. Seeing our shocked expressions, his wife said, "At first, he told us that the doll was moving at night and that he sometimes heard strange voices. He was even recording it with a video camera. I thought that if he saw his students, he would come to his senses," she said with tears welling up. We don't know what happened to our coach. What we do know is that there's something seriously wrong with the Japanese doll, and we don't know who gave it to us or where it came from. The classmate who had a seizure was in such shock to see the doll in motion, which caused her to lose total control. After summer vacation, the coach retired for medical treatment, and I don't know how he is doing right now. When I was in elementary school, there was a house nearby where an elderly couple lived. Children would often gather there, like at a daycare center. It was a place for everyone to relax after school. The couple didn't have children, but they had a cute dog. Little by little, kids who came to play with the dog and children whose parents came home late started to gather there after school. It was like having a secret lair no parent knew about. Even after the dog died, children still gathered there as a remnant of the dog. The school was aware of this place, but since no one got in trouble or complained, they did not bother us. My parents both worked, and I was an only child, so I often spent a lot of time at the elderly couple's house. They were both very kind to me, and for a kid like me, it was a very comfortable and welcoming place. Every day, more than 10 elementary school children came and went, but the couple always gave out snacks and juice. In the evening, they even served dinner for all the children that were still there. I ate with the old couple. Some children even ate dinner there every day. The old couple loved every one of us very much. But sadly, this didn't last for so long. Before I entered the upper grades of my elementary school, 2 boys who seemed a little mischievous started coming in and out of the house. At first, they were quiet, but soon I started seeing them being up to no good. Sometimes they would steal things, and others they would purposely make their room dirty. I remember them having fun playing pranks. Maybe because no one else seemed to notice the pranks, they gradually worsened each day. Then, one day, they started putting strange things in Grandpa's drinks and food, laughing at Grandpa not noticing and watching his reaction when he did. Sometimes they tried mixing in a lot of salt or sugar, and other times they tried putting in a couple of strands of hair or gummy-like sweets. That day, it seemed like the 2 of them were planning a prank similar to that. "The one who puts the strangest thing in today is the winner," the 2 made a deal. With that, both of them split off to look for strange things and came back grinning. When Grandpa brought the food, the 2 of them quickly mixed the foreign objects they had brought into his food. The food was brought to everyone at the table, with the 2 who were trying to hold back their laughter. It was time to eat. Grandpa and Grandma say in unison, "Let us eat." As usual, everyone started eating. I remember that the meal that day was a soup with lots of vegetables in it and fried chicken. It was when the old man had finished his soup. The 2 of them looked at the old man, who didn't react, and looked at each other with sinister grins. Vomit spurted out of the old man's mouth, unable to evade the table. It got right in the face of the girl sitting in front of him, and she panicked and started crying. The old man kept vomiting profusely, this time on the floor in large quantities. He collapsed to his knees, foaming from his mouth. The two who caused this had pale faces and their mouths were trembling. I was so scared that my hands were shaking, couldn't even move, and just started to cry. His wife cried out in panic, "Dear, what's wrong?" while stroking Grandpa's body. "Grandma, call an ambulance!" one of the kids shouted. Grandma quickly called an ambulance while desperately calling out to her husband. Grandpa was shaking violently and could only groan at this point. There was no reaction to Grandma's calls. The school faculty came to their house right when the ambulance arrived, because Grandma had called them as well. The teachers told all the children that they will take each of them home immediately and will handle things from there. 3 teachers divided us into groups of those who lived close to each other and took us home. They went around explaining the situation to each of our parents. That day, the image of Grandpa was etched into my brain forever. I was in such a shock that I couldn't speak properly for a while. In the end, everyone's favorite grandfather never returned home that day. Everybody was talking about this incident at school, among parents, and the town. Several students and teachers came to ask me what exactly happened, since I was one of the witnesses, but whenever I tried to tell them, I would start crying uncontrollably and no words would come out. Later, the police announced that the grandfather's soup had a high dosage of rat poison, but it was dismissed as the grandfather, who has poor eyesight, put it into his food himself, mistaking it for medicine or something. A school assembly was held, and us kids were told not to go to the old couple's house from now on, but pray individually for Grandpa's soul. Everyone around my family made my parents feel like their child has been involved in the accident, so they told me never to go there. And within a few months, a rumor started to circulate around the area. I don't know who started it, but it spread saying the food served there was poisonous. The kids that still went to visit Grandma slowly stopped going there, and now we don't see anyone near the house anymore. I saw Grandma a few times in the garden, saying hello to the children with a lonely look on her face, but I followed my parents' instructions and went back to my house without stopping by. A year had passed since I stopped going to the old couple's house, and the old lady passed away. I didn't hear the details of her death, but I think she died of an illness. It was around that time. Among school children, rumors began to spread that the ghost of the old lady still lives in that house. Well, it's a common story every elementary school has. It's not surprising that rumors would spread after something like that happened. One day, when I had a day off from club activities and got home early, I stopped in front of the old couple's house for the first time in a while and stared at the place I used to hang out so often. It was a house filled with many happy memories. I was gazing at the empty house and feeling sentimental, thinking, it's become so lonely. At the same time, a big black mass appeared in the garden. Huh? I rubbed my eyes and looked closely. It was Grandma. But at the same time, it wasn't her. Now, her eyes were wide open, so wide they almost popped out of her head. Her face was expressionless, but even I could feel her ominous energy of anger. I gasped and ran home, chanting, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. in my mind. Grandma had noticed that day that someone had put rat poison in her husband's soup. And even after her death, she was still looking for the person who had taken her beloved. It was about 6 months ago that my mother, who is now 80 years old, found out she had liver cancer. Surgical removal would be very risky, plus she may not be physically able to endure a major operation. With these facts in mind, my family did not tell her about it. We decided to let her live the rest of her life the way she wanted. One day, I used Google Earth on my iPad to show my mother's birthplace. It's a convenient world we live in now, isn't it? The last time my mother returned to her hometown must have been about 40 years ago. It had been so difficult for her to return, but now she can easily see the detailed back alleys of where she grew up on the internet. My mother was very impressed and was excited to see all the images. The elementary school she once attended was still lively and well. The houses where her friends used to live and the stores she had frequented were all still there. One after another, her memories came back to her, and she would tell me stories that I had never heard from her before. It's amazing that I can feel like I have been to a faraway place without having to leave the room. But then I heard something more unexpected from her. She told me that she was born in a place much deeper in the mountains than what we were seeing on the screen. According to her, there used to be a small village further to the mountains where people made their living by forestry, farming, and hunting. They lived a self-sufficient life. A sanatorium was eventually built near the village. The buildings were used to house tuberculosis patients and psychotic patients in a place with pleasant climate, and there used to be many of them, but they gradually decreased in number as its necessity disappeared with the development of pharmaceutical treatments and modern medicine. They would also function as good isolation facilities. Roads were built in conjunction when constructing the sanatorium, but this in turn led to the outflow of people from the village to bigger towns, and the village eventually disappeared as the residents moved on. Indeed, when I searched using Google Earth, I could not see any settlement that looked like that, but I did find a building that looked like the ruins of a sanatorium, tucked away among the streets deep in the mountains. I was beginning to think that it would not be a bad idea to visit this place with my mother, partly because I myself love exploring ruins. The enchanted dystopian feel is something you actually had to feel it for yourself that no picture could portray. It would probably be the last trip home for my mother. One day, I started the car with my mother as a passenger. This time it was a 2-person trip and a sudden one. My father has been in and out of the hospital, so I left it in the hands of my sister, giving her plenty of pocket money. After a trip of 2 hours by car, we arrived at a port. It was a 40-hour ferry ride from here. I asked my mother to lie down and rest as much as possible on the ferry. Our plan of action for today was to quickly drive and scan through the town, making the hotel our final stop. Next morning after breakfast, we left the hotel and went for a walk in my mother's old hometown. The elementary school has been modernized and cleaned up, but the number of students have been decreasing, making the school in danger of closing completely. There were some nostalgic stores my mother used to go when she was a child, but unfortunately, we did not meet any of our acquaintances. Now it was time to go deep into the mountains where my mother was born. My car is small, but it has a 4-wheel drive, which was a little pride of mine. I'd be lying if I said it was a comfortable car, but it sure does good on rough mountain roads. Cross-country driving is my specialty. However, I can't do anything reckless with my mother in a weak state in the passenger seat. I'll go as far as I can for now. We climbed up a road that looked like it hadn't been used for decades. It was covered with weed, pebbles, chestnuts, acorns, and tree branches on the surface. Occasionally, we'd see large trunks that had rotten and fallen over. The road was far from being maintained at all. At any rate, we climbed up the mountain, trying to avoid all of them. Finding what looked like the village where my mother used to live was no easy feat. My mother's memory was of her as a child, and the scenery seemed to have changed so much that she could not connect it to her own memory. I don't blame her for that. I would have been the same if I were in her shoes. Thinking about it, it was more than 70 years ago. This place used to be a bald mountain with more trees cut down, but now it's way overgrown like a jungle. We reached a certain point and could not go on by my car any longer. It was hard to tell the difference between the road and the grassy area. There were fallen trees everywhere. According to the location info on my phone, the abandoned sanatorium should be just a few more steps away. I decided to go scout there alone first. I can't hold my excitement whenever I'm near abandoned buildings. With my trusty camera in hand, I get ready to shoot any time. Mom, I'm sorry, but can you wait here for a minute? I'll be back in about 10-20 minutes, I say to her. Okay, you be careful. I leave my mother in the car and start to walk the pathless mountain. Wait, is that... Yeah, I see it. I spotted a part of an abandoned building behind a tree. The thick bushes were no taller than I was, and the plants were doing their best to cover the building. But I could see the ruin right in front of me. I think to myself, I just need to go straight. As my strides got faster, a tiny open area came into view. I could finally see the entire sanatorium in view. Just when I thought I had came across something unexpected. A line of people, maybe 10, coming out of the sanatorium. They looked rather shabby for tourists like myself. It was more like local elderly people. I wondered if this sanatorium was still in use. Reusing the ruins by the locals. I mean, it's not impossible. The lady who came out at the end of the line was carrying a picture of a child in a frame with a black belt. It looked like a photo for a funeral. A funeral in a ruin. My instinct told me to hide, so I just hid in the bushes and let them go by. The group was leaving along a different path than the one I came from. Could it be that there is still a village nearby? I thought about it, but decided to enter the sanatorium in question first. The door was unlocked. The inside was old and run down, but it was so clean that it could have been called abandoned and still in use. There seemed to be no electricity nor telephone, but surprisingly, the windows were all intact, and even if some were broken, they had been repaired or otherwise protected from the wind and rain. There were no piles of discarded trash either. The building is in a state of decay, but it had been repaired and is neat and tidy. There were so many other signs that the building was still in use. I found a stairway to the basement, so of course I decided to go. I thought it would be pitch dark, but there was a tiny window on the wall near the ceiling, so I could see well enough even in the dim light. There was a small window at the very ground level of the building, which seemed to serve as a light source in the basement. The place had an atmosphere of a hospital warehouse, and it was easy to guess that this was once a sanatorium. When I entered one of the rooms, I screamed. There was a large container made of glass, and inside the jar, a human head was submerged with yellow liquid. I suddenly felt nauseous. A human head in formalin. I thought for a moment, but then I remembered that the formalin was not a yellow liquid. I looked closely and found many thin tree branches and small flowers in the container along with the head. Perhaps the yellow color was due to these flowers. But more importantly, why was the head kept in such a place? As I looked around, feeling more nauseous and horrified, I found a beautiful glass jar that looked like it was the newest. But in it was a severed head of a child, and the liquid was still fresh and clear. I looked at it and backed away and ran out. Yes, it must be the boy in the photo the lady was carrying. It must be. The head here must have been brought there by the people in the funeral procession, but not as a medical research sample. Why are they doing this? Why would they cut off the head from the body and keep it? These thoughts kept circling my mind as I retracted my steps back to the car my mother was waiting in. I finally made my way back, weaving my way through the roadless path. But then I immediately noticed my mother was gone. A surge of unease took over me, especially after what I found in the sanatorium. "Mother!" I shouted and looked around for a while. There was no answer. I started to get worried. I tried calling on my phone, but to my surprise, the bag her cell phone was in was left in the car. I got out of the car and searched everywhere, and noticed that there was a slope that I could walk down. It was possible that my mother had gone this way. I decided to follow the path. I went further and found a narrow, almost hidden path leading into the mountains, and it led to a village. There were several small, old hut-like houses, as if completely hidden from the world. There was a clearing like a village square, and a campfire was built in the middle. There was a crowd of about 10 people gathered around it. Could those be the people who were in the funeral at the sanatorium earlier? I was looking at them cautiously, and to my surprise I saw my mother crouched down in the midst of the crowd. "Mom!" I started to run. People turned around and stared at me all at once. My mother seemed to have noticed me. "Oh my! You're here too!" "Mom, you can't just leave and walk around by yourself. I was worried, sick. This is the village where I was born." "What, this?" I looked around at the people around me. "How nice of you to come back." "Yeah, who'd have thought?" The villagers were talking to each other. "I apologize for the trouble, everyone. Come on, Mom, we're going home." I didn't trust these people at all and wanted to get my mother out of there ASAP. But my mother said, "You know, I hurt my back and I can't walk." One of the villagers said, "Oh, you shouldn't move and push yourself if you hurt your back. You can stay here tonight." "Yes, and have some boar meats too with us." The people around me were trying to make us stay. "I'm sure the sanatorium will have beds for you." Hearing all this, I was screaming inside, "No, no, no, anywhere but there." My mother and I had to get out of here. No, we had to flee. I pretended to be calm and nice. "No, thank you very much, though. I've reserved a hotel in town and I'll carry my mother on my back." "Pity, you've come all this way." "If you were born here, the happiest thing would be to come back and return to dust." What were they saying suddenly? He may have meant it as a joke, but after seeing the decapitated heads in the sanatorium, it didn't sound like one at all. I felt something unbelievably ominous about all that was going on. "All right, Mom, piggyback time." I said, crouching down in front of her. Goro, will you carry the lady? Yeah, sure. A man named Goro offered to carry my mother and guide us. I tried to refuse, but Goro held up a hunting rifle he was carrying and said, There are bears around here, and it's not safe if I don't go with you. It could be dangerous without a weapon. I had no reason to refuse, so I asked them to follow me to where we parked the car. I'm not bright when it comes to guns, but I could tell that the one Goro was carrying was quite old. The wooden part was shining black. I once saw a cartoon set in Hokkaido, and it looked very similar to the gun he was holding. The program must have been set in the Meiji era, which is around 1868 to 1912. I wonder if they are still using guns from that era. Uribo's already, I hear a voice from behind. Ah, remember to save some for me, Goro says to the old woman in front of the fire. Uribo is a baby wild boar. I once thought it would have been the cutest thing ever if it hadn't grown up. They were probably roasting it over the campfire. Eat or would be eaten, I guess. Then I took a glance towards the fire. What's that? The old woman was using something like a scratching post to scrape out the flesh of a four-legged animal that looks like Uribo from the fire. But what drew my attention was another animal that is also being roasted in the same fire. Is that even an animal? It looked like a child curled up with its arms and legs tucked in. But in the flames and without its head, it's hard to tell. Wait, hard to tell? The reason it doesn't have its head is because it was cut off and kept in the basement of the sanatorium. My head is already coming up with sinister scenarios. Just what on earth are they doing here? I wanted to scream out loud, but there was a man with a gun in front of me. If we were to be shot here, there was a possibility that we would be wiped out without leaving any evidence. So I shoved everything down my throat to take my mother and leave as soon as possible. See you next time, everyone. I'll come again when my back gets better, my mother said, greeting everybody without a care on my back. No, wait, this was fine. Them knowing we weren't enemies is the ideal situation right now. Anyway, I just wanted to get to the car and be done with everything. With that thought in mind, I walked with a faster pace to where our car was. On the way, Goro said something to my mother, and she replied, but their local accent was so strong I couldn't understand what they were saying. With effort, we finally made it to my car. I was out of breath, but I said a word of thanks to Goro, and finally we parted ways. After turning the car around in a narrow space several times, we finally headed out from the village. As I drove, I saw Goro in the rearview mirror. What I saw made me freeze. He was aiming his gun at us. No way. I hope he was just joking. Soon the car turned a corner and Goro disappeared from sight. I immediately floored it. Thank goodness. I felt all relaxed and finally lowered my guard a little. Maybe I was overthinking. If he wanted to shoot us, he could have done it any time before we got in the car. It must have just been a misunderstanding. I told that to myself and headed down the rough mountain road. We somehow made it down the mountain and arrived at our hotel. My mind was so desperate to get out of the creepy village, and I had no memory of how I got there. My mother was mumbling something in the passenger seat, but it seemed like I was replying to her on autopilot mode. I guess I was slightly panicked when driving. Once we entered the hotel room and changed into a yukata, I felt relieved, as if everything until that point had been a bad, surreal dream. I let my guard down. but I would forever regret that I did. That evening, my mother's condition worsened and she began to lose consciousness. I called the front desk and arranged for an ambulance. She was taken to a nearby emergency hospital. I also called my sister, but there was no way she could come in time. By midnight, my mother's condition had already become critical, and I asked my sister to at least wait until the next day to come here, telling her our mother's heart was still beating. The next morning, my sister arrived, and together we were with my mother to watch over her pass away. I never expected something like this to happen on such a trip. Mom's last regret was not to return to her hometown, so maybe she was relieved she got her wish, my sister said. I often hear people say that people just refuse to die because they have regrets. But if that's the case, does that mean that if a wish is fulfilled, then people can go to the afterlife with peace? What happened to that village deep in the mountains that Mom spoke of? The second my sister asked me that question, I felt like everyone in the hospital waiting room looked my way at once. I looked around, but maybe it was just my imagination, but the alarming and uncomfortable atmosphere had disappeared. Maybe I was too nervous. Yeah, about that. It's not going to be a short chat, so I'll tell you more about it when we get home, I said, dodging my sister's question. All of us then went home. We considered cremating her body there, but I decided against it and chose to take the body back to her hometown. We held a small funeral with just our family. There weren't many members we could gather. There were not so many people that had a direct connection with my mother's bloodline. There was no way we would contact that village. But things were moving in secret. After the wake, we headed to the crematorium. I looked at my mother's peaceful face in the coffin for the last time and said my final goodbyes. We ate snacks in the waiting room while killing time until the bones were collected. Eventually, the scheduled time came and the crematorium furnace was open for us. The cover of our mom's coffin was removed and some ashes flew up. Me and my family looked as our mother's bones appeared. A crematorium staff member quickly ran that must have been a large magnet around the area, removing many metal objects. This procedure was necessary because there could be nails and staples that had been holding the coffin in place mixed in. After that, the staff member looked at the bones again and seemed a little confused. Is there something wrong? I asked. The staff member opened his mouth with a grave tone. Usually we would first take the largest remaining skull, and I'm sorry, but we would crush it into small pieces. My blood froze with his words and looked at my mother's bones. There were small bones and large bones, but there were definitely no scar nor teeth. There's no Adam's apple either, the staff member said, puzzled. At that moment, I was filled with anger as an electric shock had hit me. Damn it! It was them! Them? My sister asked. The crematorium staff looked confused as ever. I knew right away. I don't know what method they used, but the fact that there are no bones above the neck means that someone cut off the head and took it away just before the body was to be burned. And I had an idea of who might do something like that. The head has been stolen. Call the police. The thief must have broken into this crematorium. Please investigate, I said, and tried to leave the building. Brother, where are you going? The cremation is not done yet. To the sanatorium, of course. I don't know who or how, but I know where the head is. I'm going to get it back. Brother! My sister screamed. Come to think of it, I hadn't told my sister any details yet, but I didn't have time. The talk can wait. Wait after I get my mother's head back. I can see it clearly in my mind now. Next to the glass jar that contained the child's severed head, there would be a new glass jar containing my mother's, along with flowers and tree branches. The next day, an article appeared in the local newspaper. It said that a fire had broken out in the ruins of a former sanatorium facility, and the entire area, including a nearby abandoned village, was engulfed in a forest fire. The fire was strong and had not yet been put out, but it seemed that there were no casualties. Somewhere in Shizuoka Prefecture. This is the middle of nowhere, and it feels like the kind of village you'd imagine as a stereotype. Surrounded by mountains, rich in nature, endless rice fields with raccoons, wild boars, deer, and monkeys all commonplace. At night, the sounds of insects and frogs are always loud, and there are hardly any streetlights. It takes more than an hour and a half by car to get to the nearest supermarket or a middle-sized town. In this rural area of my hometown, that only a select few villagers know and visit. It seems that in the past, Watanuki-sama would protect the village from disease and disasters, famine, by villagers making offerings to him. However, he is known to be a god with a bad temper. So when I did something bad as a kid, my grandparents would threaten me by saying, "Kazu, if you don't behave, Watanuki-sama will eat you." Once every few years, my grandparents still wear white clothes and perform the offering ceremony for Watanuki-sama. I was told that children were not allowed to go, so I didn't know what kind of ceremony they were doing. But I knew that the offering is always a fresh animal, such as fish, chicken, pig, or deer caught that very day. The bigger the offering is, the more Watanuki-sama will be happy and will protect the village for several years. However, there seemed to be a certain rule for this. In the ceremony, the offering must be placed in front of the shrine, and the dancers have to dance around the shrine with their backs to it. They must never look back when you do this. No matter how much they call out to you, whatever you do, you must not look back. It's said that if you make eye contact with Watanuki-sama, you will be made into an offering. The ceremony ends when Watanuki-sama finishes eating what we offered. Even as a child, I always thought it was strange. I wondered how they could know when they had finished eating, especially since they can't see gods. If animals were being eaten, surely Watanuki-sama must be a bear or something. I also wondered if it was a raccoon dog, judging from its name. Anyway, here's the main point. My grandparents also went to make offerings to Watanuki-sama. I think it was when I was in 6th grade. My grandpa told me, "I'm going to make an offering. Make sure you stay home until we get back." Of course I obeyed. That day, they came home late. I remember my parents looking a little nervous, glancing at the darkness outside the house. As expected, it was late at night when even the insects were quieting down. My parents were worried that they hadn't come home yet, so they went to check on them. A while later, we heard shouting and voices, so it must have been the end of the ceremony, and it got really noisy outside the house. I opened the sliding door in my room and took a quick look outside. Why, did it do it? It's this thing. I can't go back. It's impossible. I couldn't understand what they were saying, because the voices of several people made it hard to focus on one, but I understood what they were arguing about. I noticed my grandparents were still out there, but so were the other village people and several monks from the temple. There were people I didn't even recognize. Detecting some ominous and strong entity made me feel uneasy. I tried to quietly close the door, but it made a louder squeaking noise than I expected. At that very moment, everyone's head turned towards me, noticing this artificial sound. From a quick glance, I noticed two old men from the neighborhood holding two children. My mother came running over, and they all disappeared from my field of vision. She told me with an urgent tone, "It's okay. There's nothing going on. Go to bed early." And with that, I was taken back inside the house. But I couldn't fall asleep, even in bed. How could I, after all I've seen? I pretended to be asleep and listened to what the adults were talking about. "I can't believe the kids from were here. We should have been more careful. It's good that we noticed it soon. If it was any later, it would have been all over the place. But I wonder if it will go back to normal. It might be difficult. I can say we were lucky that it was only a mental thing." I know everyone in the village, so I knew the name of the child who was the victim. But what on earth happened to him? After deciding to ask the kid tomorrow, my mind drifted away into a sweet slumber. The next day, I asked my parents and grandparents about the day before, but they would just evade a question, changing topics and getting out of the room. So I decided to go to the kid's house, but it was empty and there was no one there. Alright, so no one can give me answers. I walked through the woods to the mountain shrine where the ceremony was held. The further I went, the thicker the vegetation became, and the air was dense with smells of mold. The sunlight was covered by the trees, and there were more rocks than roots under my feet. As I took each step, paying attention not to fall or trip, I suddenly came to an open space. There was a small shrine standing alone in the center. Being mesmerized, I was drawn to it. As I approached the building, the double doors seemed to open a little. Just a little more. Just as I reached out my hand. "Kazu! Where are you? Kazu!" I was startled by the sudden voice of an adult from behind me, so I quickly hid in the bushes nearby. No, am I going to be in trouble? After a while, several adults and monks from the village came near the shrine. They desperately seemed to be looking for something. I thought I should go back so I wouldn't be found and scolded, so I slowly moved my head. And that's when I saw a small child's hand rolling on the ground. What? The wrist was behind the trunk of a large tree. Every fiber in my body told me not to look. I immediately threw a stone that was near me in the direction of the adults, and when they were looking at the opposite direction, I ran down the mountain as fast as I could. I don't know what happened to them after that. Soon after, the child's family moved away from the village. It's been more than 50 years since that day. That's right, the name Watanuki-sama, when written in kanji, Wata means intestines and Nuki means taker. I realized that only a few years ago. It seems they haven't done any offering ceremony since that day. I don't really want to remember, but I will write about an experience I had. I'll make it clear in advance that this is not a story about ghosts or supernatural experiences. This story begins 4 years ago when I, Yoko, was 20 years old and was working at a company. I met a man named Ono who had come to repair work on the exterior wall of the company. He was 17 years older than me, but looked younger, so at first I thought he was about 27 or 8. The reason I started talking to Ono was that my senior college fell in love at first sight with his friend, who was also a repair worker, and they became very close. It turned out that Ono seemed to like me very much, so he invited me out for drinks a few times. Even before I even considered Ono my type, he was 2 older than me, so I didn't see him as a romantic interest at all. But my senior told me, Ono is always in a bad mood because you don't come, and the atmosphere at the drinking parties is unpleasant. You might not wanna, but please come, even if it's just for a little while. So even though I had already made up all sorts of excuses to refuse, I couldn't do so this time. I thought it would be okay if it was just once, so I went to the drinking party. When I started talking to him, Ono was a kind, friendly guy who seemed to be trusted by the people around him. At first, we were all having a great time talking about trivial things, but as we drank more and more, Ono started to pry. Yoko-chan, do you have a boyfriend? Where do you usually hang out? Yoko-chan, what kind of alcohol do you like? Hey Yoko-chan, how many people have you dated so far? Yoko-chan, 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 Yoko-chan. I was totally fed up with it, so I answered, yeah, I guess so, and ran off to drink. After a while, my senior got drunk and fell asleep, so I thought this was my cue to get out of here. I looked after my senior and left the drinking party. Nothing in particular happened that day, but the next day, I had the day off work and was relaxing at home when I got a message on my cell phone. It's Ono. Were you okay yesterday, Akari-chan? It seems like you drank quite a bit. Maybe Akari was the senior's name, but I wasn't so sure. For a moment, I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't even remember exchanging email addresses with Ono yesterday. No matter how much I drank, I can handle a lot of alcohol, so I'll never forget. When I asked Ono how he knew my email address, he said this. Oh, sorry, but yesterday while Yoko-chan was in the bathroom, everyone around us started yelling, "Get her email address while you can." And I got carried away and did what they said. That's right. Ono sent emails from my phone to his own phone without my permission while I was out, and even called him. At first, I protested it to him, half annoyed about why he would do something like that. But Ono apologized over and over again, saying, "I'm happy to be just friends." He apologized so many times that I thought he was being honest, so I forgave him at that time. After that, he didn't send me emails as frequent as I have worried, so I was relieved. But one day he suddenly sent me an email saying he wanted to meet after work because he had something to talk about. By this time, the repair work had already been completed, so I didn't see Ono again. I wondered what was going on, so I waited outside the office and Ono came right up. But when I saw him, I was shocked. Ono was dressed in a pure white suit and was holding a small bouquet like the ones brides carry at weddings. While I was stunned, Ono handed me the bouquet and said, "I want to go out with you with the intention of getting married." I was surprised at what he was saying, since we hadn't even met or had a proper conversation since that drinking party. But I politely declined and left Ono there and ran home, because it was in front of the company and I didn't want to be seen by anyone. But from that night onwards, Ono started acting strange. These are the emails he sent me. I'm sorry about earlier. You were surprised because it was so sudden, huh? I'm not angry at all. Smiley face. Please send me an email. Yoko-chan, why haven't you replied to me? I'm pretty impatient. Mad emoji. Why didn't you reply to me earlier? How long are you going to ghost me? I'm sorry, I won't keep sending you emails. Please, at least answer the phone. I'm sorry, Yoko-chan. I'm sorry, Yoko-chan. I'm sorry. I received dozens of messages like this until the morning. Seems like his mood shifts on a dime. Some of them even had photos attached that they had taken secretly at the drinking party. I was so scared that I went beyond anger. I really wanted to yell at him, but he knew where I worked, so I thought it would be bad if he came to my company. I quickly recognized Ono's email address and number, blocked him, and deleted him. And the last message I received from Ono was this. Yoko-chan, have you ever wanted to die? I wouldn't mind dying if it was with Yoko-chan. I was honestly horrified, but Ono's obsession didn't end there. One day, about 2 weeks after the last message, I was watching TV at home when I received an email from an email address that wasn't registered on my cell phone. I'm at the convenience store in XX town right now, but Yoko-chan's house is around here if I remember correctly. You're off work today, right? Let's go hang out somewhere. Smiley emoji. It was an email from Ono. Ono had come to a place only a few miles away from my house. What on earth? How did he find out? I was frozen for a while in shock and fear. I grabbed my cell phone and quickly changed my email address. And without leaving the house, I prayed that my house would not be found. Looking back, there were various measures I could have taken, such as asking a friend to cover or calling my parents, or even call the cops. But sadly, I was so scared that I couldn't even think about such things. Luckily, Ono didn't come to my house, but in the end, the greatest fear was waiting for me. Maybe because I changed my email address, I didn't hear from him at all after that, so I almost forgot about him. I would occasionally remember him and say to my senior, "That guy is really crazy. I thought I was in so much trouble. I never thought he'd be that kind of guy." That was the only thing we talked about. My senior said she was really sorry for introducing me to Ono. One day, when I was taking a break with my senior, she looked at her cell phone and suddenly her expression became cloudy. "What's wrong, senpai?" I've been getting silent calls from unknown numbers since this morning. Even if I block the calls, they keep calling from different numbers. I wonder what's going on. You should be strict with them when you call. Shall I take over? Yeah, sorry. I pressed the answer button on Senpai's cell phone and answered the phone. As expected, the other person was silent the whole time. Hello? Hello? The other person was just silent. I got annoyed and yelled at whoever this was. "You've been annoying us this whole time. Tell me your name." "You finally answered, Yoko-chan. How are you?" It was Ono's hoarse voice. I instinctively threw away my senpai's phone and my body started shaking uncontrollably. After that, my senior and I were both half crying, and we changed our phones together that same day. Additionally, my senior asked Ono's friend to convince Ono not to get involved with us anymore. After that, I never heard from him again. So I wasn't scared anymore, but I never really liked being around men to begin with, and this little happenstance made me distrust them even more. And I lost a lot of hair from the stress. Even though we're only connected by phone, people can drive someone to that point. It was really scary. So be careful, everyone out there, not to tell your contacts before seeing their true nature. I, am what you call a person who can see ghosts and spirits. Oh, that doesn't mean I can do anything. I can't communicate with them, much less get rid of them. I just know that they are there somehow, or that they are not a living person. There's nothing going on because I pretend I can't see them, and I ignore them completely. I have a hobby of observing ghosts like some people love observing others. I have several episodes of monitorings I did, so I'll tell you about one of them. Was it 3 years ago? There was a girl who joined the bar where I work. Her name was Ira. Our bar had a few employees in their 50s and 30s, and Ira was in her early 20s or so she was especially young. The regulars didn't even hide gawking at her. She had a small face, bright eyes, a slender nose, and full, luscious lips. She was petite, but had a good style and charm to her. But the very first day I met her, I was horrified. With a smile, she said, "My name is Ira. Nice to meet you, senpai." Ira-chan greeted me politely, but my eyes were glued on what was on her back. She was carrying countless malicious spirits. How many? I lost count. But I remember there were cats, dogs, snakes, and so on. I felt sick even though I hadn't had a drop of alcohol in my system yet. I didn't tell anyone that I could see them, so I just talked to her lightly and kept my distance. Let me say, Ira herself is not a bad girl, except for the fact that she is possessed by hundreds. She's a bright, energetic, normal girl. I spent a few days thinking, maybe she's cursed. What a pity. One day, I recognized one of her customers was possessed behind Ira-chan's back. What the... The words slipped out before I could swallow them. And unfortunately, Ira-chan didn't miss it. That night, she talked to me on the way home. "Good evening. Good work today. I'm sure I'm not mistaken, but you can see things, can't you? Like what normal people can't." Oh yeah. I knew it! Then you see what my shoulders carry. You've been wondering about that, right? Yeah, I'm not sure of what to do, so if you're in trouble, Ira, you can have an exorcism or... Ira-chan suddenly started laughing. With a smiling face like she always does, she looks at me and continues talking. "I tend to get lonely easily. That's why I don't do exorcisms or anything like that. Do you know? Dead spirits, at first they hold a grudge against you and haunt you for a long time, but gradually they disappear when they forget what they were holding a grudge against or when they're satisfied. But then, when that happens, they disappear. But the living spirits stay with you forever as long as you're alive." Behind the smiling Ira-chan, there were men with void expressions, customers mumbling to themselves, and animals that seemed to be entangling her. I wonder how far this child has come. The insanity of this child's smile was too much for me, and I ran home without saying a word. The next day, when I went to work, I felt awkward to see her again, but Ira-chan was not there. She suddenly quit without telling anyone why. It happens all the time, especially with young people. Phew, thank God. I thought I wouldn't have to feel sick and haunted for the time being, but was I naive? One day, when I turned around, there she was, Ira-chan. She was behind me with that smile on her face and all kinds of things attached to her. Just then, I remembered her exact words. The living spirits stay with you forever as long as you're alive. A story from my junior from college. Junya noticed it when he went to the beach 2 weeks in a row as a student in a swimming club. In the second week, his skin was peeling due to sunburn from the previous week's exposure to the sun, and when he was resting after getting tired from swimming and his body was drying off, he suddenly noticed his skin began to peel, so he tried pulling it off gently around his left wrist. He thought he got a good peel, about 2 inches in radius, so he had a stupid idea of peeling bigger skin surfaces. It was kinda like a game to him. He held down the peeled, thin dead skin with a pebble to stop it from being blown away by the wind and started to pull off his skin again. When he peeled it off around his elbow, it was the largest one yet, so when he tried to compare it with the first peel skin he had placed on the ground, his eyes widened in surprise. He said that a sea urchin had been munching on the first peel. For some reason, witnessing a natural creature devouring what had been his skin until just a moment ago thrilled him. Junya thought, I see, not only bears and crocodiles, but even such small creatures sees humans as food. He recalled in an accident in Brazil or some other country where an infant was bitten to death by cockroaches. However, he said that the reason he was shocked was not because he was scared of being eaten by other creatures, but because he felt an indescribable masochistic pleasure. So, this feeling became what he would call it. He said that while he calmly thought it was strange that he had felt pleasure from his own body being eaten, he was extremely excited to have found out this fact. He's a nut job, right? Yeah, I don't understand it either. For a few days after returning from training at the beach, he peeled off as much of the skin as he could and diligently saved it in a Tupperware container. He also saved his fallen hair and nail clippings, and apparently even saved dead skin particles, like eraser shavings, that came out when you rub your palms when it's moist. He also said he made them from the soles of his feet and heels. When he had accumulated a fair amount of what used to be his body, he decided to have them eat it. The rental house Junya lived in was an old wooden one, and inhabited not only by cockroaches, but also centipedes, paramecium, and cockroaches. There were also mice, and sometimes snakes appeared preying on them. Apparently, the rent was cheap, but he lived in a place like that. If it was me, you'd have to pay me to live in a cave like that, but I digress. He thought they would surely eat his peeled-off body, so he spread a newspaper in the corner of the kitchen floor and separated out his skin, dirt, hair, and nails and placed them there. He even borrowed an 8mm video with a night vision function from a friend and recorded it to see what kind of creatures would show up. Until the second day, there was no change in the meal placed on the newspaper, so he didn't check the recording. But on the morning of the third day, his skin had been reduced to about 2/3. He skipped his university club that day, hurried home, and checked the recording without eating. Apparently, It was a centipede that had been eating the skin. It had been munching away for about 20 minutes when a mouse came and ran away. Then, to his surprise, the mouse started eating the dead skin particles. Junior said that when he saw it in the morning, he had been distracted by the skin and hadn't noticed. Mice eat stuff like this too? Junior wondered, and after looking into it, he found that this was possible. The hair and nails were not touched at all, so after about 10 days, he threw them away. He had ran out of sunburnt skin, so he continued making dead skin particles and saved it up for others to eat. And then it happened, the following summer. Junior was out in the mountains when he was bitten by a viper and had to have his right leg amputated below the knee. When he was told about the necessary operation, while lying in this hospital bed, he said that his mind went blank and he couldn't speak. He had to give up his hobby and training, so this is understandable. Poor guy. After the surgery, Junior was dejectedly saying goodbye to his leg, but the hospital told him to request the crematorium to cremate the body part himself. The hospital would issue an amputation certificate, and he would then be asked to submit the request to the crematorium. He thought the hospital would just treat it as some kind of waste. Junior suddenly had an idea and thanked the viper. Yeah, you guessed it right. He wanted to have something eat his right leg. He knew it was nothing like thin skin or particles, and just thinking about it made him shiver with anticipation and excitement. Listening to him, I was more than grossed out. I'm not sure if I should go into too much detail from here on, so I'll keep it brief, but it seems he got what he wanted. It would be impossible to do this in a public place like a zoo, so they relied on an individual who knew people, and waited until the owner and the staff were gone. The lucky one who was chosen to eat the leg was that hairless dude that eats quickly and doesn't leave any bones behind. Witnessing the viper swallowing his leg, the sensation and pleasure was so exhilarating he thought he could collapse at the spot. He's a total psychopath. I nearly collapsed myself just listening to him. Since he lived alone, he managed to hide the fact that he had disposed of his leg this way from his parents. I feel sorry for Junior, who lost his right leg, but since then we have gone our separate ways. He's a good guy, but somewhere in my heart I loathe the idea that this abnormal side of him exists. Every time I see him, I feel like something is missing from his body, and it scares me. However, I am worried that Junior's name might appear in the news one day about him being attacked by a bear somewhere. It might not have been an accident, but it is something he would want from the bottom of his heart. Won't he notice that he'll never have the privilege of feeling the thrill if he died in the first place, I wonder? I'm going to tell you a story about my girlfriend who is having problems with a stalker. Her name's Ami, and she goes to college from her parents' house. The first case was being stalked on the way home from her part-time job at night, followed by a silent phone call for an unknown number, and recently, a creepy guy grabbed her shoulder. I was also worried about Ami and tried to cheer her up by escorting her on her way home when I could, and by calling her at night, but she always seemed to be in tears. Poor girl, she must be so scared. One day, after hearing the conversation between Ami and her friend Keiko, I decided to use my paid day off the next day to face the stalker that was pestering her. I heard that they were going to stay at Keiko's apartment where she lives alone, and I realized that this was dangerous, so I decided to make night patrols to protect two women. Of course, I didn't have the audacity to go into their house And more importantly, I didn't know Keiko so well. So I decided to patrol around the apartment on my own, so to speak, in the spirit of a volunteer. On the day of the visit, after Ami arrived safely at Keiko's house, I called her in the dark of night when the lights in the house were fading away. She had not picked up the phone recently, but since she was with her friend, she picked it up. I said on the phone to her, I'm nearby, so don't worry. I was so nervous that my voice was hoarse, probably because I hadn't talked to Ami in a while, but it seemed that she was still terrified of the stalker, and I heard a short scream or moan through the phone. Ami, is that the stalker? I heard what I thought was Keiko's voice for sure. I was surprised that a stalker had appeared in the vicinity, even though I was on my rounds, and I immediately rushed to Keiko's apartment. I looked up from the street to see Keiko's room glistening in the light, and asked over the phone, "Are you alright?" Ami only cried and spilled out trembling, "Help me." I looked up at the window and saw her looking out onto the street, talking on her phone. Later, as I was knocking on the front door of Keiko's house, some police came, probably called by her. They thought I was the stalker and they seized me. I told them over and over about the possibility of a stalker hiding in the neighborhood, but they put me in a police car to accompany them to the station, probably to hear more details. I would do anything to cooperate for the sake of Ami. After I told the police the full extent of the stalking situation at the station, they must have understood, because after signing some documents, I was released. Ever since then, the police patrols around Ami's house have increased, so it seems that my role in this case is over. A year has passed since then, and the police patrols have been lifted. I was relieved to see that Ami had recovered from the fear of being stalked and was doing well. So I decided to visit her for the first time in a while. I'm looking forward to see what kind of expression she would make when I see her. I can't wait.